I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on this penultimate episode of 2019. Today I'm very pleased to be speaking with Suzanne Scott, the author of Fake Geek Girls, Fandom, Gender, and the Convergence Culture Industry. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Radio, Television, and Film at the University of Texas at Austin. And just by coincidence, the same school as Domino and Rachel from my last interview. Apparently they're doing really great things at the University of Texas at Austin. She's speaking to me today about her book, which deals with gender dynamics in fandom and is a really, I think, timely. I know I say this about like every book, but seriously, this is a timely book. It is something that is important for us to think about, particularly in the wake of things like Comicsgate and Gamergate and any other gates that she talks about in the interview. Gender, fandom, and the idea of who owns media products in the convergence culture industry is I think, super important idea, and I'm very happy to be able to speak with her about her opinions and her research on this topic. Suzanne, thank you so much for being on the show today. I'm very happy to be speaking with you. Maybe you can say a little bit about what Fake Geek Girls refers to and why that's a sort of interesting and important part of your book, like the fact that you've taken this term, and obviously it's something that you discuss within it, but what do you mean for people who aren't familiar with this idea of fake geek girls?
Well, this whole notion of the fake geek girl is something that really sort of rose to prominence right alongside the mainstreaming of fan culture over the past decade. And it was this idea that women couldn't possibly be authentically self-identifying as nerds or geeks or fans. The idea was that because sort of fanish identities had become more mainstream or had become cool in the sort of cultural zeitgeist in this moment of sort of superhero movies and franchises and all of that sort of good stuff, that women were just sort of glomming on to this identity as a way to sort of make themselves more appealing. And certainly women have been in fans and geeks and nerds for a very long time and have been involved in fan culture for a very long time. But they historically have been erased both within mainstream media representations of fans and geeks and nerds, and also often within fan culture itself. The one place they are very prominent is within fan studies, which is the field that my work resides in. So I was always well aware of this. And as a female fan, I was always very well aware that fandom was a very diverse space. But the fake geek girl rallying cry really was mostly taken on by predominantly small packs of white, straight male fans in order to sort of dismiss and delegitimate women within fan spaces.
Part of the interesting introduction to your book is the outline you give of how fan studies has changed over the years, which, it's not exactly my field or anything, so I always feel like I know a little bit about it in relation to cultural studies and popular culture, but it was interesting to see this breakdown because it seems like a new field on some level, but on another one, it seems like we're entering a second, maybe even a third stage. So can you say a little bit about how fan studies has changed academically in the last little while?
Sure. So fan studies emerges, as you note, out of cultural studies, but also out of TV studies and feminist media studies and queer theory around the late 80s, early 90s. And in particular, there are a couple of key works in the early 90s, around 1992, that really cement the field. So I'm thinking of work by Henry Jenkins and Camille Bacon-Smith and Constance Penley in particular. But so what's been really interesting is it's a fairly young field still, but it is a field that has rapidly grown and diversified and evolved in the past 10 years, particularly alongside the sort of rise of digital fan culture and a turn towards the more general audience becoming more participatory, right? And media sort of demanding that and encouraging that in particular ways. So it wasn't no longer was just, sort of small subcultures of fans who were engaging with media in this very intense, effective way. We see more and more general audiences flocking more towards cult media properties to sort of hyper-serialized media text. And so what you have is this kind of interesting moment for the field where historically it's been focused mostly on female fans, and often the sort of unspoken female fan would be a white, straight female fan. which was often not named, but sort of implicit in the groups that were being studied early on. And it was really focused on these female fan communities of practice and the text that they would create and circulate within those communities. So things like fan art, fan fiction, fan video, the sort of creative works and practices of fans. And so fandom was always sort of conceptualized, at least from the beginning, as both a feminine space, but also a potentially feminist space. And obviously, it's sort of increasingly difficult to claim that in particular ways, even though I think I think I still align fandom with the sort of progressive politics and activism in particular ways that I think is really powerful and positive. But obviously, fandom is a vast, seething, diverse space now. And so I think what's been great to see about fan studies over the past decade is that really you've seen the diversity of types of fans, types of fan practices, types of fan identities really get explored in ways that the sort of earliest work was not. So we now have increasingly work on race and fandom, transcultural fandom, thinking about the ways in which, maybe fan practices that historically were not necessarily seen as like politically resistant and thus powerful, things like, buying fan merchandise have been reassessed in really interesting ways, or fan tourism, right? So I think in general, we've seen the field really grow and evolve rapidly. But some of that has involved some growing pains around this notion that potentially we were losing some of that feminist sort of undercurrent that sort of what we used to sort of align with the field. And so the book is really interested in exploring what happens and why we sort of need to sort of reclaim and reassess and reimagine that feminist valence of the field, particularly at this moment in history.
Maybe you could say a little bit about what happened or what you think happened, where it seemed like, this, at least the way academics would think about fandom, it would be a very progressive and potentially at least liberating feminist space. And then you get Gamergate and Comicsgate and a bunch of things that...
All the gates.
All the gates, yeah. And so there seems to either there was some kind of, I guess, mistake or blind spot from early text, academic text, or something developed that wasn't foreseen, or maybe there was something else. But yeah, what happened to this potentially really liberating feminist space that gives us all of this spreadable misogyny, as you name it, which is, I think, a really interesting, cool term we can talk about as well.
Sure. The grand irony of this, of course, is that sort of Gamergate and Comicsgate is directly sort of cultivated in response to this perception that feminists and or so-called sort of social justice warriors, and I'm putting that in very big air quotes that you can't see right now, have sort of taken over fan culture, and that they have an outsized impact on the ways that media industries produce content, right? So in some ways, the sort of Comicsgate and Gamergate movements that are often sort of characterized for their misogyny and their racism towards minority fans, other minority fans or other minority creators, really is kind of like, in some ways we can maybe say, well, is this like a win? Has fandom officially entrenched itself as this feminist utopian space, and this is what these people are having this kind of reactionary response to? And the answer is, of course, no. I mean, I think that for me, the promise of fandom is always the potential to reach that kind of utopian space of inclusion. I don't think it ever has. And I think that fan scholarship rightly kind of readjusted itself from its sort of early years of thinking about this as like a wholly utopian space where everyone is sort of equal and accepted and welcome. Increasingly, we're seeing more studies of fragmentation within fan communities, racism within even progressive fan communities. And I think those studies are really important in part because I think it's too easy to paint a narrative of fan culture as being this politically progressive space. We've also seen it obviously be a very reactionary space. And I think what's important to note is it's not just the Gamergaters or the Comicsgaters that we associate with these kinds of reactionary movements against feminist fans and fan practices. It's the fact that the industry sort of often tacitly will endorse a kind of vision of fandom that is much more skewed towards a lack of activism, a sort of like acceptance and just sort of pure consumption of an object rather than a desire to sort of fix and change it, which we tend to associate more with feminist fan practices. So, but I think what the key takeaway I would say is that, it's not just these small pockets of internet trolls that have sort of exposed the notion that fandom is not actually a beautiful place or a progressive place. I think what I wanted to get at in the book, and I tried to a bit, is that there's also so-called progressive pockets of fandom in which racism exists, sexism exists, homophobia, transphobia exists. And we need to be, in some ways, we need to reimagine the feminist project of fan studies in part to account for those issues as well.
Well, and one of the interesting things that you point out is that there's a policing of identity within fan communities that it seems on some level counterintuitive, because you have, like, I think a lot of people will envision fans as already a small group looking to fit in where they can, which is in their fandom. Because of whatever other issues are going on, they don't feel like they fit in maybe elsewhere, or at least that's the conception that some people might have of fans. And so the idea of fans kicking people out or policing fandom and their identities seems odd, because it seems like they would want to, I guess, get together with whoever likes what they like, right? But that doesn't seem to be happening exactly. How is policing done in fandom, and why is policing done in fandom?
How policing is done in fandom is through a number of means. And so you mentioned sort of this term spreadable misogyny that I put forward. In that chapter, I really look at examples of like memes, right? So there was a sort of meme that went around called the idiot nerd girl meme that was all about, it was predicated on the same kind of fake geek girl logics where like girls couldn't possibly genuinely like geeky media objects. They're feigning their affect for these things in order to get attention, these sorts of sort of stereotypes. So this meme went around and was quickly reclaimed by female fans and sort of in very clever transformative ways. But what I thought was really interesting about those moments is that's not an example of out and out harassment or hate speech or doxing or the kind of more spectacular modes of boundary policing we see with things like Gamergate. This is a very subtle and ultimately sort of very tongue-in-cheek and funny kind of, way to spread a very similar idea, which is that women are not welcome within this culture. Women do not belong naturally within this culture. And that if they do claim a fan identity, it is feigned or somehow performative and thus must be interrogated and ultimately dismissed. So I was really interested in looking at the more subtle examples of boundary policing. I have to say, though, one of the main motivations for writing this book came all the way back in 2009. I go to Comic-Con every year, and that was the year that there was a very small protest that was sort of dubbed the Twilight Ruined Comic-Con protest. And this was probably at tops, 50 people at any given time, predominantly, I would say, white men in their, early 20s. And they were holding up signs like Nosferatu didn't sparkle and like Twilight ruined Comic-Con and all these sorts of signs that were sort of gendered genre discourse around this idea that Twilight was an unacceptable media property to be at Comic-Con. That was really responding to an influx of young women who were attending Comic-Con that year in part because of their fandom for Twilight. And I remember as a woman at the con that year feeling a little bit, taken aback. Because I sort of associate Comic-Con with a very sort of friendly, welcoming, diverse space. And it was the first time that I really saw emerge a kind of active attempt to sort of alienate women within that space. So moments like that I have personally experienced as a female fan certainly inflect my own understanding of gender boundary policing. I also get it as a professor. I mean, I teach classes on, Star Wars and video games and comics and all of these kind of geeky things. And I very frequently get interrogated by my students to sort of authenticate my identity and my credentials, right? I think that my own experiences are brought to bear on this. Why they're boundary policing is an entirely different and messy set of questions. I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that boundary policing is this very counterintuitive knee-jerk response to the perception that fan culture has become mainstream. So there's a kind of nostalgia for this idea that fan culture used to be this exclusive subculture that was relatively small and has now become too big, too inclusive, too oriented towards minority audiences. And so what was really interesting to think through in the book was this idea that you sort of nodded to this sort of conception or cultural stereotype of the fan or geek or nerd as being a little bit sort of culturally isolated or potentially looked down upon. And why wouldn't they just all want other people to like the things they like? That's what fandom is about. And correct, that is how fandom should operate. But fandom is ultimately a very hierarchical place, and it has been for a very long time. But the ways in which these hierarchies are getting formed nowadays along gender lines and the way that gendered boundary policing practices have sort of increased over the past 10 years, I think speaks a lot to the fact that the people doing the boundary policing tend to be those that the industry has consistently messaged to that they are the most important audience members. I'm trying to look at in the book a sort of convergence of conditions both of the sort of mainstreaming of fan culture, but also the ways in which media industries and indeed other fans sort of message to each other who is the sort of most important player within any given fan community.
That starts to, I think, answer a much bigger question, which is, why study fandom? Which I'm sure, you've answered enough, I'm sure, from a lot of other people. I definitely get that kind of thing. I'm working on something on Batman right now, so I definitely am used to justifying sort of, why is it that this is an appropriate thing for scholars to do? So I'm not exactly asking that, but how does fandom or studying fandom relate to larger social issues? I mean, is this a sort of microcosm that you view as indicative of the broader political world or something, or is it something else? How do you? Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot and do that.
That's a great question, and I think part of it, I appreciate your framing of that question as well, because having just gone through the sort of tenure process and doing a lot of justifying documents where I justify why I study what I study. It was on the forefront of my mind. And I understand that fan studies from an outside view can look very frivolous, or can look they're just studying the thing that they're personally sort of invested in, right? I think we all study what we're personally invested in and what we think is culturally important. So that's not just fan scholars, but I appreciate you framing.
And I also ask, I think, more so that people listening who are interested in or are doing fan studies, I think, see how you at least would answer that and how you've become accustomed to answering that for their sort of benefit when they're speaking to others as well. Not so much to put you on the spot and challenge it, but to say, how do we get together and say, these are some reasons why this might be a really important thing to look at. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a reason to say that we don't have to justify this anymore, but how do you even begin to approach why fan studies?
Well, I think we do still need to justify it. And I think part of it is because when you see sort of even the contemporary job market, well, fan studies is a massively booming field. Just purely anecdotally, in terms of the amount of sort of graduate student applications we get at our program for people who want to do fan studies, it's going to be becoming a much more prominent subfield within media studies over the next several years, if I had to guess. Mm-hmm. What I will say is that I often sort of talk about and look at fandom in part because I do think it is often a cultural bellwether for things to come. I think that often fans are sort of early adopters on many different levels, right? They're often early adopters of technology and shape the ways in which technology is used and used for particular cultural purposes. Often the kinds of tensions that we are seeing around, and I certainly make a case for this in the introduction of the book, I sort of state that we didn't need to look much further than the tensions that were playing out within fan culture, particularly around the time of Gamergate, in the 2010s, to sort of see the moment where Trump is elected, right? Mm-hmm. This sort of being driven by the same kind of nostalgia, the same anxieties about a loss of centrality, right, in one's perspective. So I do think there are definite broader political corollaries to make between, say, protests by particular groups of fans about The Last Jedi, in terms of the way that Luke Skywalker is being represented, or the fact that they're sort of centering women and people of color in the Star Wars franchise right now, and the ways in which we sort of read these various, takes from the New York Times about why people are voting for Trump and sort of behind that whole alt-right movement in Middle America right now. I don't think there's a neat line to be drawn between them. And I certainly wouldn't want to sort of say, we just need to look to fandom to understand these broader political movements that are happening. But I do think you can see a lot of the seeds within fan culture that get planted and then sort of blossom into these broader political movements or dovetail with them in really interesting ways. So a lot of the rhetoric that you see in this so-called sort of rise of toxic masculinity in fan culture overlaps very consistently with sort of discourse within men's rights movements, for example. So I think that there are ways in which fandom sort of serves as a very intense microcosm to think about broader sociopolitical issues. I think that's absolutely the case. I also, though, think that to go on the other, maybe slightly more positive side of things, I also think that fans are very often on the bleeding edge of forms of media activism. And so I think we are in this moment right now where we're in a sort of representation matters moment right now within the media industry. And I think that fans have historically been at the forefront of those kinds of calls for change as well. So I do think that there's many ways we can look to fandom as being a space to examine these kinds of cultural tensions, fans, cultural toxicity, cultural activism, often when they're in their infancy, and then thinking about how they spread more generally to the sort of broader populace.
When you're thinking about like fan studies, do you need to, or is there a reason to make distinctions between various ideas, like maybe per medium, like video games versus comics versus television or something, or per sort of genre, I suppose, or like there are many ways to divvy up fan studies, or fans, I should say.
Yeah.
Some are quite different, some are quite similar. How do you conceptualize that as a fan studies scholar? Like, obviously you want to be more nuanced than saying all fans are the same, but you could get really bogged down by the minutia of the different groups or the different properties. So how do you conceptualize fan studies?
Well, this is a conversation we have in the field quite a lot. In part because I think things like music fan studies or sports fan studies are often sort of confoundingly not put into conversation with broader work in media fan studies, which tends to focus more on film and television and comic books. The players of games are people who are very have a deep affect for video games, and that we would historically call fans, don't necessarily call themselves fans, right? They might call themselves gamers, which is a sort of related identity, or they might call themselves players. And so I think part of this, for me, always comes down to how are actual fans self-identifying? Thinking about the ways in which that maybe helps us shape who we sort of put under what umbrella category and what kinds of fandoms we put into conversation with each other. That being said, I think that a lot of time what we're talking about within our field is the fact that a lot of fan studies orbits around television. I think that is partially because of the medium specificity of television, right? The fact that fans often are consuming a given media text over many years. Back in the old days, before things were dropping on Netflix all at once, there was the wonderful kind of structured seriality of television, which meant that fans could have conversations and produce media objects in the week-long breaks between installments of the text. And so I think there's a reason why a lot of fan studies emerges out of television studies and still does to this day. However, I think that ultimately, I do think there's something very valuable about this idea of sort of trying to move towards a more generalizable understanding of the properties of what we call a media fan, and including things like sports fandom, which is obviously a mediated form of entertainment, right? And or video game fandom in that mix. I think part of this is just citational practice. So that's about scholars really making sure they're not just sticking to sort of TV and film media studies. I think like reading more widely in terms of fan studies literature to see what might be productive for them to use. I think part of this also comes down to the fact that we will often debate the fact that we tend to orbit around the same series of texts. And thus we tend to be studying the same types of fans and the same types of fandom. And that creates a kind of stasis in the field that I don't think is productive for it long term. And I'm certainly guilty of that too, right? I think a lot of this does come down to fan scholars tend to be studying media forms and or media texts and or fan communities they are already sort of intimately familiar with or potentially even deeply involved in. But I think one of the major issues with that is it means that we have like ample work on, your Harry Potters and your Doctor Who's and your Star Wars and your Losts, right? But we don't have work on sort of more niche media objects, more independent media objects, and thinking about how fandom operates in those spaces. And I think that ultimately probably is a problem for the field moving forward, but one I think that a lot of fan scholars are very attentive to and trying to actively rectify right now.
Yeah, well, and that also, I think, brings up the issue of pleasure. I mean, there's this sort of Protestant work ethic idea that, work should be hard and different than pleasure or leisure. And fan studies can kind of confuse that or flip that in some cases because, a lot of people who are fans, like during their leisure time, will invest in a TV show, for example. In an academic setting, they might write about it. And I think some people who don't do that or don't see that as valuable, the specific reason they do or don't like that kind of stuff is because of the idea that, well, you're getting too much pleasure out of this. This isn't serious work. Therefore, it's not to be taken as seriously. What do you think the role of pleasure in doing this kind of academic work, but also in taking part maybe as a fan should be or should not be? Like, is there I don't. It's weird. It's weird to think about it in that sense, perhaps.
No,
but
not
yeah,
at all,
how do you?
not at all. And I think one of my favorite quotes ever to be published in the field of fan studies comes from Henry Jenkins, who's very influential and has helped establish the field and continues to be very prolific and influential on it. Jenkins described fandom as a mix of fascination and frustration, right? And I frankly can think of no better definition for the work that academics do, or what drives academics to do the work that they do, is often a mix of fascination and frustration, right? We are often, I think there is this notion, and I think part of this gets back to issues of gender that I'm bringing up in the book, but I think there's a very masculinized notion of objectivity that is still very much valued within the academy, that fan studies disrupts in particular ways. I think that for me, the component of pleasure absolutely does not hinder the work. I say that with a bit of a caveat that I'm going to get to in a second. An anecdote that I'll get to in a second.
Always a caveat to pleasure.
Always a caveat, yes. But I will say that I think, to me, pleasure enhances the work, right? But that pleasure, I think, is often equated with being uncritical. And I think that that is the issue. The idea is, like, fans take deep pleasure in the media that they consume and the communities they participate in, but they are also deeply critical of that media that they consume and the communities that they participate in. And I think that's the thing that's often missing in an understanding of what fandom and indeed fan studies is and is doing. I also firmly believe in the tradition of feminist media studies and queer theory that, like, bringing one's own identity and experiences and pleasures to bear on the topics that you are analyzing is not a weakness of one's scholarship, but actually can be very much a valuable asset. So I sort of reject the premise, I guess. But I also will say this. I started when I was writing my dissertation, starting to write my dissertation, I was writing it all about the Harry Potter fandom, which I was very, very enmeshed in at the time. And I got about halfway through that dissertation project, and I kind of had a moment where I sort of stepped back from it and I said, I might be too close to this thing. Like, at what point, I do think there needs to be a kind of checks and balances system where you think about the ways in which your own pleasure, your own experiences, your own perspectives are enhancing the work, and the ways in which they might be hindering the work that you want to do. And so I actually just completely scrapped like half a dissertation project and moved on to something else, in part because I realized that at a certain point, part of those concerns were ethical. So I was like, do I really want to be sort of putting these communities that I have spent many years establishing connections in? Do I want to be using this as my own like personal petri dish for this sort of work that I want to do? I wasn't totally comfortable with that, frankly, as a fan, but I also was concerned about the ethical considerations as a scholar of doing that work. And then I also just sort of felt like, sometimes I think sometimes fandom has to be just for you and for your personal pleasure and not your sort of intellectual pleasure. And I think that was the case for me with that project. But I just in general think that there is a kind of gendered dismissal of the role that pleasure or affect, whether positive or negative, plays in the way that we pick which subjects to study and think about how we study them and how we engage with them over time. I don't know many scholars in media studies or elsewhere who aren't at least somewhat emotionally invested in the work that they do. It might not bring them pleasure in the same way that we might be defining it generally, but I think there's definitely an emotional investment. I don't know how you do this work for as long as we do it if you don't have that going for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it's interesting as well because, as you point out in the book, like there's an illustration you have in here about a guy wearing a Green Lantern shirt and somebody saying cool, and then a female wearing a Green Lantern shirt and getting quizzed on all of the Green Lantern trivia that she's expected to know in order to be like a real fan. And it's interesting the parallel you might see because, like, I've totally seen, well, in my experience, Marxists saying like, okay, so you're reading Capital. Did you know this, and this, and this, and have you not read this? And how can you be a serious Marxist scholar or something? Which is interesting in the way that gets put into a sort of gendered language of superiority or I guess like outsider status.
Yeah. If there was one emblematic image from the book, I think you've just picked it out. I think if I just had to throw an image up on a slide at a conference and say, this is what the book is about, it would be that one. So I'm glad that you mentioned it. It's an amazing comic that I love the title of as well. It's just titled Am I Right, Ladies, which is very much pitched at other female fans who've experienced similar kinds of attempts to authenticate identity and perform mastery in a particular way that is often part and parcel of most gendered gatekeeping practices in fandom and elsewhere, as you note. But I think it's also about age, too. I think you hit an interesting point that I don't talk about as much in the book, and I'm going to be talking about more in my future work, which is the way that also, like, a lot of these practices revolve around age. So the Twilight Ruined Comic-Con example, I think, is that I gave earlier is interesting, in part because it's about pitched at a sort of derided gendered genre object, right? So it's supernatural fantasy and romance that they're sort of taking issue with. Mm-hmm. And it's also pitched the fact that this is a product that is a media object that appeals predominantly to women, but predominantly to young women. And so a lot of the targeting in that instance was the fact that these were young women and not just women that were entering the convention space. And I think that your example of Marxist is interesting as well, because this is often a sort of senior scholar to junior scholar sort of attempt to perform mastery or to sort of say, you haven't even begun to do the work that you have to do in order to sort of qualify as a rigorous Marx scholar, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that these practices happen everywhere, and I think we need to be attentive to the ways in which identity shapes who gets to perform those practices and in what contexts.
In furthering that discussion a little bit, I mean, it's interesting that you say even your students might ask you to like prove your fandom if you're teaching on a certain subject and claiming fan status in relation to it. I mean, that seems on some level to make sense that, if you're claiming to know a lot about Harry Potter or you want to be taken seriously as a scholar and you're writing about Harry Potter, it seems like you may have to show some sort of credentials in the sense that you know who these characters are or what happened here or whatever details are pertinent. But you also, you definitely don't want to repeat what's in that comic, which is, well, first of all, a very biased idea of who should and shouldn't be expected to know that stuff. But also, like what is relevant for a certain level of knowledge, and then what is just ridiculous or not about this kind of scholarship we're trying to do and is something else. Like, how do you measure, basically, if you're writing about Harry Potter, how much you should know about Harry Potter or divulge about Harry Potter?
Well, so 2 points on this. The thing I love about that comic is that it trails off. Like, she is actually responding to the questions that she's getting peppered with, like, do you know the Green Lantern Corps, whole speech, and do you know what, you know every Green Lantern that ever was, and et cetera, et cetera. And that comic tapers off. And I think what's really powerful about that visually to me is this notion that, like, this is a zero-sum game. Women will never authenticate themselves. There is no amount of trivia that one can spew. There will always, the questions will keep coming until something comes that is so arcane and so sort of minute in its knowledge base that you get the answer wrong. And then you've thus proven that you are fake, right? No matter how many questions you answer correctly prior to that. And so it's really a game that women can't win to a degree. And I think that comic really powerfully states that. What I think it also powerfully states, and something that I talk about quite a bit in the book, is that, like, the sort of notion of sort of judging one's fanish merit purely based on the amount of trivia and the sort of encyclopedic capacity of a given fan to know every little bit of flora and fauna that exists in a fictional universe is a very sort of masculinist notion of what it means to be a fan and how value is judged. So again, like, if you started asking me, like, what are your favorite Harry Potter pieces of fan fiction, and like, what about this fan fiction author, and like, oh, were you on Tumblr when this, this gift set dropped? Like, that's an entirely different set of knowledge that we tend to associate more with female fans, but that's never what the testing is about, right? So I think what's interesting is there's been a lot of debates within fan studies about, like, to what degree should you be a fan of the thing you are studying? Or to what degree should you be within the fan communities that you're studying? And some people would very compellingly argue there should be no requirement for you to be a fan of the thing you're studying. You can still study a fan culture without being a fan of the object or be within that culture. And there's others that would very compellingly argue the opposite, that being within the culture and being within the community and knowing the text very intimately gives you a degree of insight that others would not have, and that's why you should be doing that work. But what's interesting about all that is it's still sort of predicated on this idea of, like, the text being central. And very often, particularly within female fan communities, the text stops being central to a degree. So we talk about often, like, the sort of fanon and the canon, right? So, like, the canon is all the sort of authorized industrial works that the fandom is sort of orbiting around, the TV show, the movies, the comic books, all of that. The fanon is often an entirely different set of sort of textual understandings that are often born out of fan interpretations of characters or born out of fan-produced media or objects, things like fan fiction, that sort of take hold as being like somehow more textually important than the text itself. And we haven't done a ton of figuring out like what it means to test that as being a kind of merit of authenticity, or think about the ways in which fan scholars need to know that kind of information in order to sort of claim they have an understanding of the fan culture. I would say that most fan scholars probably have a bit of both sets of resources, and that's why they're doing the work that they're doing.
Maybe you can say a little bit about the differences that end up often being gendered in their perceptions of the transformative fan culture versus people who are mostly interested in the canon and knowledge of that. Like, how do we structure those understandings of fandom, and why have they become gendered, or why were they maybe always gendered?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so part of this is I have to sort of offer the inevitable statement up front, which is that, in the book, because I'm talking about this kind of binaristic approach to fan identity, this binary approach to fan identity, I frequently I'm kind of forced, maybe is the wrong word, but I lean into kind of essentialist understandings of what constitutes sort of masculinized or feminized types of fan practices, or the types of fan practices that women have historically done versus the types of fan practices that men have historically been sort of oriented towards. And I realize that those are essentialist statements, and there's plenty of male fans who write fan fiction and create fan art. And there's plenty of women fans who are very invested in canon and trivia and all of these things we've just been talking about. So I feel compelled to state that up front. Mm-hmm. That being said, I do think that historically, one of the main takeaways I hope people leave the book with is that the kinds of fan practices we've historically associated with male fans, so things like more affirmational fan practices that I talk about in the book, things like trivia and sort of mapping and maintaining continuity within a given fictional world and fully exploring it, and collecting and these sorts of and curating objects. These sorts of practices align much more neatly with the sort of interests of capital and the interests of the media industry, right? They tend to be more consumption oriented, and they often tend to be completist in their consumption, which is like the, holy grail of consumer behavior. And historically, women within fan culture have performed more transformative works, which is to say that they have often had a very fraught relationship to the media object they are a fan of. They're often sort of working to repair it or conform it more to their own sort of textual predilections or practices or identities. And consequently, they're the more threatening types of fan engagement that the industry rightly, historically, has been a little bit more reticent to embrace. What's been really interesting to see over the past couple years in particular is the fact that those kinds of neat categories seem to be breaking down quite a bit. We see more and more industry reaching out to fans to create transformative works. So, sort of like thinking about even like the Joker did a sort of recently did a sort of fan art campaign, right? Where they were saying, give us your best Joker fan art and we'll use some of it for the promotional campaign for the Joker. Now, granted, I have a whole chapter in the book called Terms and Conditions, very pointedly, which delves very deeply into these terms and conditions sheets for these kinds of contests that I'm fascinated by. And very frequently, we still see that they conform to very canonical, masculine-oriented notions of like what is and isn't appropriate creative content to produce. So I still say that there's still a very gendered notion of what is and is not acceptable forms of fan engagement, even as industry reaches out more and more to fans who are doing practices we've historically aligned with women. So there's a bit of a bind there that I think is interesting to see how it will play out over time, particularly as fans, I think, assert their fair use rights to sort of take media and transform it as they will more actively.
Yeah, and actually, after that, some of the chapter or the next chapters are about sort of modeling the ideal fan behavior, usually according to the property owners. So we have a number of like very high profile fans that have made it and that become the sort of, it seems, the model that people are supposed to follow, which is often very masculine and very oriented towards the canon. Where do you see that leading, or what are the possible, I guess, dangers of having these kinds of model fans that are incorporated and oftentimes sponsored to some degree by the companies that own it? But of course, there's issues with that you highlight in the book. What are the issues that we might be worried about or looking at skeptically pessimistically or critically when we see these kinds of modeling of fans in the mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so the delineation between affirmational fandom and transformative fandom that we were just talking about actually comes from a fan post, a blog post. And what I love there is that they align sort of affirmational fan practices. We tend to be more focused on the canon and more masculine dominated modes of engagement as like sanctioned fans, right? And transformative fans or female fans are unsanctioned fans by industry. So I think a lot of this to me comes down to questions of who gets standardized as a kind of like as a fan to more easily occupy fan identity in public spaces by industry. So I think part of this comes down to what kinds of fan identities are standardized in these moments where we sort of elevate particular sort of cultural players to be model fans for people. And then also, how do they then sort of endorse sanctioned fan activities as part of that modeling, right? So the classic case that I talk about in the book are people like Chris Hardwick, right, who created Nerdist and eventually went on to be the host of Talking Dead, for a wide variety of other sort of geek-affiliated properties. And ultimately, part of the problem here is not just that Chris Hardwick is a white straight man and thus we sort of affiliate fan identities with those identity markers or continue to certain degrees in a stereotypical way. Part of the problem for me there is always this idea of sort of like what kinds of engagement with industry get modeled in spaces like the Talking Dead, or what kinds of, the ways in which, Hardwick sort of will shut down particular types of criticism or like only particular fan voices will make their way onto a platform like Talking Dead that is ultimately meant to be about featuring fan feedback to the show. What comes out of this is a very imagined celebratory relationship that fans have with media objects. So like none of the critiques of the ways in which, that show often is killing off Black characters, for example, are going to make their way onto the Talking Dead. Likewise, Chris Hardwick is going to project a very sort of happy, imagined relationship between industry and fan culture in which everyone is satisfied and happy all the time. And so I think a lot of that, to me, the dangers are really about this idea of re-entrenching ideas about who can occupy fan identities and who cannot, but also thinking about entrenching notions of the right way of doing fandom is the way that the industry sanctions and is most profitable for industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that I think it's interesting that you use Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility in relation to this, because basically, white fragility relates to the idea that people become very distraught when you mention privilege, because basically a lot of white people in North America in particular are used to not having to deal with race and to be very comfortable. And so to make them uncomfortable is a very frightening thing. And you point out how that idea in general can be transposed onto certain fans. What is fan fragility, and how might we start to think about that as we kind of move forward in this discussion of what it is that you're talking about?
Right. It was something that I came to a little bit late in the process of writing the book. And I wish I have plans to sort of expand that out over time, because it's a concept I think is really productive to think through. I see fan fragility operating at two distinct levels. There's the fan level. So like oftentimes when we talk about fan fragility, it's often the same types of people that Robin DiAngelo is talking about. So often sort of white straight men who are sort of being forced to engage with shifting notions of representational diversity, and they often react very defensively and nostalgically to kind of reclaim the notion of both fan culture as a space that is dominated by white straight men, but also like textually thinking about sort of recentering white straight men as the kind of heroes of these stories that fandom tends to orbit around. So The Last Jedi kind of pushback is a classic example of fan fragility in that sense, right? Where people were sort of responding negatively to this notion that like women of color and women in general were being centered in this narrative, and that Luke Skywalker was sort of pushed off to the margins of that story. And so fan fragility is operating at that kind of level that I think is really interesting to look at. Now, granted, some of this notion of fan fragility is sort of contra what DiAngelo is talking about, seems to be about the fact that fandom is now not pathologized, as you note, right? It seems to be an odd response to, or defensiveness to the sort of mainstream acceptance of fan identities and practices and cultures, that people really want to retain that sense of exclusivity. That is also a sort of motivating factor that I think is slightly different than what D'Angelo is describing. The second frame that I wanted to talk about with fan fragility is coming out of fan studies, because I think there's also a kind of defensiveness amongst particular sets of feminist fan scholars, and I would probably count myself very firmly amongst this group, to the notion that fan studies is sort of diversifying in particular ways, and we might be moving away from a notion that we're centering women within our understandings of fan identity and culture. So I think it's a slightly more dynamic kind of interplay. And I think it's happening at multiple levels that are interesting to explore, but I didn't really get to explore it in enough depth. And that's why it sort of comes tacked on at the tail end of the conclusion. But I do think that there's ways in which the notion of fragility, or thinking about, I think what's going to move a lot of research on fan studies over the next couple years, particularly as incidents of, quote unquote, toxic fan behavior remain in the news, is trying to sort of theoretically work through why people are having this defensive reaction to various incidents within fan culture. And I think D'Angelo's work is really instructive in terms of thinking about both the ways in which a sort of lack of stress can sort of motivate those responses, as you know, a lack of race-based stress. In the case of white fragility, but the ways in which those stressors might be very different and distinct within fan culture. And that's something I think we're still sort of working through collectively as a field.
Yeah, well, I mean, that seems like a great place to go now, is where do you think fan culture and fan studies is likely to go, or in what direction? Because it seems like one narrative that I'm not saying you're necessarily espousing is that there was this sort of utopian world of progressive feminist people who are getting together, and that's been maybe destroyed by the alt-right or whatever groups there are. Another way of looking at it is maybe like it was never that great anyway, and it never will be. But I think the most optimistic way is that, it started off as, I don't know, like uncharacteristic in many ways, but has become sort of more progressive or more open to I don't know, cultural diversity, and it will continue to be. I mean, those are obviously very cookie cutter ideas, but where in general do you think fans and fan studies will go in the next, I don't know, decade or so?
I think that both fandom and fan culture are reckoning right now with many of the issues you just addressed, which is this idea that there has been an investment in imagining the political potentialities or the activist potentialities of fandom, often at the expense of engaging the more subtle or pernicious or pervasive ways in which structurally fandom won't allow that to happen. And I say that, like that extends to both the kind of obvious examples of toxicity that we've been talking about, but it also extends to sort of a notion of like white feminism and fandom, right? For example, and white feminism and culture generally. And so I think that what's really wonderful is there's a kind of moment that's happening right now where both within fandom and within fan studies, I think that there's been a lot of interrogation of, well, if that's the ideal or if that's the utopian vision that we want to strive for, we need to sort of like air out the dirty laundry and actually engage with and grapple with the problems within fan culture. And that, historically, fan studies has not done a great job of engaging race. I think that's definitely changing. It has been very Western in its views. I think that's changing. So I see a lot of positive change happening on both of those fronts and others, right? I think that the fact that we have this injection of so many amazing junior scholars in the field right now is going to change the field radically and in ways that we might actually get to the place that we kind of imagined when the field first started. And that's really exciting for me. I also think that per my book, which is sort of interested in drawing connections to broader political movements, I think that's happening much more actively. We're seeing in a lot of the fan studies work that's about to come out. I think it's virtually impossible in this political climate to not draw connections between sort of fan culture and politics more actively. There's already been a couple of great publications on this that have come out. I know that others are working on that right now, but I think the sort of like notions of like reactionary fandom, I think are going to be definitely a place that we go in the near future. And I'm excited to see more theorization of that. I also just think that, personally, I'm excited to think about other ways of thinking about fandom that we haven't yet explored. One of the fun parts of being in a pretty young field is that even though it's expanding rapidly, there's a ton of things we haven't talked about enough. So my entire next book project is kind of moving back away from the digital and thinking about like the lived bodies of fans and thinking about, we don't really think about the kind of politics, particularly in the era where you can, go to your local Target and pick up any array of Fanish t-shirt that you want. We don't really think about the policies of like wearing Fanish t-shirts out in public, or the ways those kinds of bodily performances of fan identity and practices are received by others. So I'm really interested in thinking through like the notion of the fan body as it relates to the fan body politic, and thinking about how we can sort of maybe actually get back out within actual lived fan communities and talk to actual fans about how they're thinking about the ways in which, if fandom has become this kind of mainstream mode of consuming media and is not this kind of controversial cultural category that it once was, I do still think that talking to people about their lived experiences as fans becomes even more vital to understanding the ways in which this category might still be pathologized for particular types of fan bodies. I think we also need to think about moving beyond gender to think more about not just race or culture or nation, but also to think about things like ability and size and all these other kind of identity markers that we have historically kind of pushed off to the side within the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are good points. And like you said, there's so much potential for expanding this field and this set of studies in many different directions. I'm thinking to concretize that a little bit. Are you going to San Diego this year then?
I go to San Diego every year. I've been going for 13 years now. Yes, I go to San Diego every year. It is both my annual holiday and also kind of light research every year.
Yeah. Well, okay. So when you're going this year, what will you be looking out for maybe as you're walking through the halls or as you're in line or what have you? But from your sort of critical scholarly perspective, what will you be looking for? What kind of details or questions might you be asking? And what would you encourage maybe others who will be there or who will be at similar events to, just pay a little more attention to now that you've raised a lot of interesting issues in your book and in this conversation? What will you be looking for? And what would you encourage other people to look for maybe while they're in line or while they're waiting to do whatever at the convention?
That's a great question. I would certainly encourage people, like, Comic-Con is maybe the optimal space to think about industry fan relations, right? Mm-hmm. And how those evolve over time. So I'm always really interested in thinking about the ways in which, say, the sort of off-site experiences have boomed over the past couple of years. They call them activations, right? Mm-hmm. But oftentimes these are about giving fans and attendees at the convention an opportunity to like physically place themselves within the fictional world of a given media property. So, if you waited online, for 4+ hours to get into the Brooklyn Nine-Nine activation last year, you got to actually walk into the bullpen. It was like a recreation of the bullpen featured on that show. Mm-hmm. And down to sort of like items on particular characters' desks being very reflective of them. And it was a very pleasurable and surreal experience to be in that space. And it was technically an escape room, so we had all these tasks to do, but all I wanted to do was like physically be in this space and be physically close to these characters that I love so much. So I would ask people to think about the ways in which they are actually invited into the fictional worlds of these properties, often more frequently in physical ways as we do these kind of offsite activations. I would ask people to think about the ways in which sort of discourse at particular panels is talking about fans, because I think that's often very reflective of where the industry thinking is at the given time. And personally, I'm a cosplayer, so I'm always very interested in thinking about cosplay at the convention and how... Particularly, I'm really interested in thinking about how cosplayers mash up and reappropriate and take the iconography of very recognizable characters and adapt them to be more personally meaningful for them. So there's like a whole group of like hijabi heroes who takes, very canonical superheroes and like redoes all those costumes with like the hijab, right? And so I think those kinds of moments to me are where fandom is most beautiful and most living up to its potential and most interesting. So those are the things I'm always looking out for.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a lot to think about. Are you one of those people that like have a secret cosplay in the end, or do you tell people what you're doing in advance?
Oh, I tell people in advance. I am certainly not like by any means a kind of professional level cosplayer, although I did whip up a pretty great Doc Ock this past year at Comic-Con that I was pretty proud of. We tend to do, we tend to do like one major build every year because that's about all we can fit in our suitcases to get out to San Diego from Austin. And then we do a couple of more casual cosplay. So things like, maybe like Linda Belcher from Bob's Burgers, which basically is just jeans and a t-shirt and then, a wig and some glasses. So yeah, but it's never a secret. I'm often very loudly proclaiming what I'm working on Twitter at any given time.
Okay, cool. So maybe people can check that out too if they're interested in seeing that. Have you ever been to Dragon Con, by the way?
I have not, but this year I'm making it a priority. I am going this year. Yes, because I've been wanting to go for like a decade now, and I know that it is like the prime space to see great cosplay. And every year I'm thumbing through hundreds of photos on various social media feeds and bemoaning the fact that we didn't attend. So this year I think I'm going to definitely make it top priority.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I haven't. I've been a few times now because I didn't even know about it before I moved. I'm just outside Atlanta,
Oh, yeah.
so now that I've seen it, it's almost like an addiction to just go to the hotels, even if you're not participating, and see what's going on. Because there's some amazing cosplay there.
Absolutely. And I think definitely the next book project is going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot on cosplay and performance of character. And so like it's partially to get back to your point about like pleasure and research and where those two things intersect. I think I'm definitely, as I'm looking forward to the next year and thinking about what cons to visit, some of that will be pleasure, but a lot of that's going to be research moving forward too.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of cool stuff to think about with your book and this conversation, and I'm sure there's a lot of cool pictures to check out then in relation to the work you'll be doing on fandom and its representation and embodiment. Thank you so much for speaking to me today. It was really interesting and informative, and I'm sure a lot of people, if they haven't checked out Fake Geek Girls, will be motivated to do so now.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
I really do appreciate people listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Make sure you check out tinapp.org, where you can see Suzanne Scott's 5 book recommendations. If you're in the giving mood, you can buy a coffee for the podcast, which is not necessarily a literal coffee. It can often be going towards books and going towards the recording equipment and everything that is involved in this. So if you want to show some support during this holiday season, click on that Buy Me a Coffee button that's up now on the site. Anyway, there's going to be one more special podcast for 2019, and then if you can believe it, we will be in 2020, where I won't say who it is, but I have recorded a very cool interview for the beginning of the year, and you'll have to stay tuned for that. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.